6 million alien refugees had nowhere to go. Then humanity opened its doors. The alarm woke me before my own mind did. Red light filled the narrow sleeping pod, and a voice repeated the same words over and over. Air levels critical. Air levels critical. I had heard that alarm every day for 3 months. But this time, it did not stop after 10 seconds. It kept going. My name is Vesic, and I am writing this down because I need someone, somewhere, to know what those months felt like. Not the official record, not the numbers in a report. The actual feeling of counting your own breaths because you are not sure how many are left. I pulled myself out of the pod and floated into the main corridor of our ship, the wandering route. 6,000 people lived on that ship alone, part of a larger fleet of 900 vessels carrying 6 million of us. We were the last of the Threnody people. Our home star had been destroyed by a weapon so old that even the record of who built it had been lost. We had 4 hours of warning before our sun collapsed. 4 hours to decide who could fit into a ship and who could not. I do not want to describe what happened to the ones who could not fit. I have tried to forget it myself. I will only say that 6 million of us made it out, and that number felt like a miracle for exactly 11 days, until we understood that surviving the collapse was only the beginning of our problem. Nobody wanted 6 million refugees. I learned this fast. The first alliance we reached was called the Vantar Coalition. Their reply came within a day, which felt promising, until I understood what the reply actually said. Their exact words were kind on the surface. Our systems cannot support additional population at this time. We recommend you try the Ashvelin Concord. The Ashvelin Concord took 11 days to answer us. 11 days of drifting, 11 days of our engineers rationing power in a way that made the ship colder every night. Their answer, when it came, was not a rejection and not an acceptance. It was a price list. Landing rights per person, payable in rare minerals we did not have, because those minerals were still sitting in the ground of a planet that no longer existed. By the time we understood that no one nearby intended to help us, we had already lost 40,000 people. Not to any attack. To simple math. To air scrubbers that could not keep up. To water that had to be measured out in careful portions. To a medical bay that ran out of supplies for anything beyond the most basic treatment. I remember my cousin, a young girl named EU, going quiet around that time. She did not cry. She did not complain. She simply stopped talking, as if speaking took more energy than she had left to spend. We drifted for weeks with no destination, because every destination we tried to reach either refused us outright or demanded something we could not give. I began to believe that this was simply how the universe worked. That kindness between strangers was a story told to children, not something that happened to real people in real danger. Then someone on the bridge picked up a new signal. It came from a system we had only heard about in old survey records, a system the local inhabitants called Sol. Nobody expected much. We had been disappointed so many times that hope itself had started to feel dangerous, like something we could no longer afford. The voice that answered was not calm and official like the others. It sounded young, almost surprised, like the person speaking had not expected to be the one answering at all. The words came through our translator a moment later. That is a lot of people. Hold on. We need more ships out here immediately. I did not understand the tone at first. Every other message we had received sounded careful, measured, designed to protect the sender from any obligation. This one sounded like someone who had already decided to help before finishing the sentence. Within 6 hours, and I want to repeat that number because it still amazes me, within 6 hours, ships began arriving. Not warships. Cargo carriers, water haulers, medical transports, vessels that looked like they had been pulled together from a dozen different countries and organizations that did not always agree with each other. I later learned that these countries were still arguing about cost and capacity, even as their ships were already docking with ours. The argument and the rescue were happening at the same time. I found that strange at first. Why send help before finishing the disagreement about whether to send help? It took me a long time to understand that this was not carelessness. It was simply how they operated. They did not wait for perfect agreement before acting. They acted and argued about the details later. A woman named Grace came aboard the wandering route during the second wave of ships. She wore a suit that clearly was not designed for our narrow corridors, and she had to duck constantly to avoid hitting her head on the low ceiling panels. I expected her to introduce herself with a title, the way every other official we had dealt with introduced themselves. Instead, she asked where the children were. I brought her to the section where IU sat, still silent after weeks of not speaking. Grace did not try to make her talk. She simply sat down beside her, on the cold floor, and stayed there. She had a small piece of food in her pocket, something soft and warm that she said was called bread, and she placed it near Iu's hand, without pushing it toward her. "I need to check on other sections," Grace told me, "but I will come back." She did come back, twice more that same day, each time bringing something small, a blanket, a cup of something warm. She never asked Iu to speak. She never asked me why Iu was silent. She simply kept returning. I asked Grace what her people wanted from us, in exchange for all this help. Every other group we had contacted wanted something, and I assumed humans were no different. Grace looked at me for a moment, and then she said something I still think about. She said that eventually there would be paperwork, and rules, and probably arguments about where everyone would live long term, but right now, none of that mattered. Right now we just needed a place to breathe, and that was the only thing that mattered to her in that moment. That phrase stayed with me, a place to breathe. I had expected negotiations, demands, some kind of price. Instead, I received a piece of bread and a woman sitting on a cold floor next to a silent child. Over the following days, more of the fleet arrived at our position. Ships large enough to carry thousands began ferrying our people toward a planet none of us had ever seen before. I remember standing at a viewport as our transport approached, watching the blue and green surface grow larger, and feeling something I had not felt since the night our sun collapsed. I felt something that might have been hope, though I was almost afraid to name it that, in case naming it made it disappear. We landed in a wide, open region that the locals called the Midwest. I later learned this was farmland, land used for growing food, though at the time all I saw was flat ground stretching toward the horizon, dotted with small buildings and a handful of local residents who had gathered to watch our ships descend. I expected fear from them. I have seen fear directed at newcomers before, in every species we had ever encountered. Fear makes sense when 6,000 strangers suddenly appear in your field. What I saw instead confused me at first. A woman in a wide hat was already setting up folding tables, laying out large trays of food, calling out to anyone nearby to come and eat, because she had made far too much, and somebody needed to help her finish it. Her name was Nora, and she ran what she called a diner in the nearby town. She told me later that she had heard about our arrival on the local news that morning, and had simply started cooking, without waiting for anyone to tell her whether it was allowed, or whether the town council had approved it, or whether there was some official process she was supposed to follow first. She said the idea of people being hungry nearby, while she had a working kitchen, did not require any process at all. EU ate that day. It was the first food she had eaten willingly in nearly a month. She sat in a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, eating slowly, carefully, as if relearning how. She still did not speak, but she ate, and for the first time since the collapse of our sun, I allowed myself to believe that we might actually survive this, not just in body, but in spirit as well. The following weeks were not simple. I want to be honest about that, because a story that pretends everything became perfect overnight would not be true, and I promised myself I would only write the truth here. There were arguments in the local town about resources, about space, about how 6,000 new residents would affect schools and roads and water supplies. I heard some of those arguments myself, standing outside meeting halls where local leaders debated late into the evening. But here is what struck me most. Even while those arguments continued, nobody stopped bringing us food. Nobody stopped bringing blankets. Nobody stopped visiting the temporary shelters where our people rested. The disagreement happened in one room, while the help continued in another, as if the two things did not need to wait for each other. I began to understand that this was simply a pattern with these people. They could disagree fiercely about how something should be done, while still doing it. A man named Peter, who worked at the local school, began teaching some of our younger people the local language in his free time, without any payment, without being asked by any official body. He told me he simply thought it would help, so he started doing it. When I asked whether the school district had approved this, He laughed and said he would ask eventually, but he did not see the point in waiting. I noticed this pattern everywhere I looked. A retired teacher named Alice organized meals on her own initiative. A young man named Daniel, who worked repairing local machinery, spent his weekends fixing broken equipment we had brought from our ships, refusing any payment, saying only that he liked puzzles, and our equipment was the most interesting puzzle he had seen in years. None of these people waited for permission. None of them seemed to need a formal reason. They simply saw a problem nearby and worked to fix it. Grace visited us often during those first months, and slowly, I came to think of her less as an official representative and more as a friend. She told me once that her own government back home argued about almost everything, that disagreement was built into how they made decisions, sometimes so deeply that outsiders assumed nothing would ever get done. And yet, she said, when something urgent happened, when people were actually in danger, something in her culture seemed to shift. The arguments did not stop, but the help did not wait for them to finish either. I asked her why. I wanted a real answer, something beyond politeness, because I had spent months believing that no species helps strangers without expecting something valuable in return. Grace thought about it for a long moment before answering. She said she did not fully know why, only that most of the people she had grown up around seemed to believe that watching someone suffer, when you had the ability to help, was a kind of failure they could not accept in themselves. She said it was not about being perfect. It was simply about not being able to look away. I have thought about that answer many times since, not being able to look away. It sounds so small when spoken aloud, and yet it explained everything I had witnessed. It explained Nora setting up tables of food before anyone approved it. It explained Peter teaching language lessons for free. It explained Daniel spending his weekends fixing our machinery for no payment at all. None of them were acting from some grand plan. They simply could not stand to see a problem nearby and do nothing about it. EU began speaking again, nearly 2 months after we landed. Her first full sentence, spoken quietly to Grace during one of her visits, was a comment about the bread Grace had first brought her, saying it needed a little more salt. Grace told me later that this comment was the happiest she had felt in years, though she also pretended to be deeply offended by the criticism, which made EU laugh for the first time since the collapse of our sun. I stood in the doorway and listened to that laugh, and I felt something inside me that had been frozen since the night our star died begin to soften. We built a settlement over the following year, a place we eventually named New Vantage, though several of our human neighbors joked that the name sounded a little too dramatic for a cluster of houses next to a wheat field. I did not mind the joke. I found I rather liked it. I still do not fully understand why humanity responded to us the way they did. I have read a great deal of their history since arriving here, and I know they are not a simple or peaceful people. They have fought among themselves for reasons that sometimes make no sense to outsiders, carrying grudges across generations, repeating conflicts that seem to serve no one. They are not perfect, and I do not intend to pretend otherwise in this account. But somewhere inside all of that complicated and contradictory history, there exists something that activates the moment strangers arrive at their door in genuine need. It does not ask what advantage there is in helping first. It moves before the argument about cost has even finished. I have stopped trying to explain it as strategy, because it clearly is not one. It behaves more like an old habit, something stubborn, that survives every disagreement about whether they can afford to keep it. We had nowhere to go. Every door we knocked on before reaching this system had closed, sometimes politely, sometimes with a price attached, but closed all the same. And then we reached a system that, by every measure we understood, had no obligation to help us at all, and somehow that was the one place that opened its doors before we had even finished explaining how much trouble we were in. I think about Nora's folding tables sometimes, set up in an open field before anyone had given her permission to do so. I think about Grace sitting on a cold floor beside a silent child, offering nothing more than a small piece of bread and her patience. I think about Peter teaching language lessons for free, and Daniel fixing broken machinery on his weekends, simply because he found it interesting. None of them were following official instructions. None of them were rewarded in any meaningful way beyond a simple thank you. They acted because something in them could not stand to see a problem nearby without trying to help. EU is older now, and she speaks often, sometimes more than I would prefer, which I say with great affection. She has taken an interest in local cooking, spending many afternoons at Nora's diner learning recipes, occasionally correcting Nora's seasoning with the same confidence she once used to correct Grace's bread. Nora pretends to be insulted every time, and IU laughs every time, and I have come to treasure that small exchange more than almost anything else in my new life. I do not know what the future holds for our people here. I know there will be more arguments, more disagreements over resources and space and long-term plans, because that seems to be simply how humans handle nearly everything. But I have learned not to fear those arguments the way I once did, because I have seen now that the arguments and the kindness are not opposites here. They exist side by side, sometimes in the very same room, sometimes even in the very same person. If there is one thing I want anyone reading this account to understand, it is this. We arrived here with nothing, carrying only the people we managed to save, and the memory of everyone we could not. We expected to be turned away again, the way we had been turned away so many times before. Instead, we found strangers who set up tables of food before asking permission, who sat beside silent children with nothing more than patience and a small offering, who fixed our broken equipment for the simple pleasure of solving a difficult problem. I do not know if humanity fully understands how remarkable that behavior looks to someone who has seen the alternative. I do not think most of them realize what it means to come from a place where every door closes with a price attached, and then arrive somewhere that opens its door simply because you are standing outside it, cold and afraid, with nowhere else left to go. I hope they never have to learn what that feels like from the other side. I hope they never stand at someone else's door, desperate and uncertain, wondering whether anyone will answer. But if that day ever comes, I want them to know that the people of Threnody will remember exactly how their doors opened for us, without hesitation, without waiting for permission, without demanding anything in return. We will open ours the very same way.